During the Gilded Age of the 19th century, the United States underwent extensive reconstruction through industrialization. Industrialization evolved America into a blossoming, technologically advanced nation. Factories, mines, mills, and other manufacturing plants sprung to life nationwide, producing goods which progressed the economy. However, with these massive changes nationwide came many drawbacks, including political unrest. In addition, with the development of new workplaces came the hiring of new workers. Many people were willing to work, so employers made wages low and living and working conditions poor. The reaction to these changes resulted in an explosion of labor movements and strikes across the U.S. One of the most notable strikes, the Pullman strike, involved workers stationed throughout the whole country and served as a pivotal point in U.S. labor legislation. Pullman Car Company had a few different manufacturing plants in the U.S. One in particular, based out of Chicago, Illinois, was created and owned by George Pullman. During an economic depression in 1894, the Pullman Company was forced to lay off workers of the Chicago plant, and the already low wages were cut by 25%. Much of the workers lived in the company town housing of Pullman. Even after these wage reductions, George Pullman refused to lower rent payments on the property of Pullman. Already enraged with current labor conditions, these new company adjustments sparked the beginning of a Pullman worker revolution known as the Pullman strike. Many of these workers faced starvation and barely had enough money to support their families. Some workers tried to meet with the president of the company, George Pullman, to complain about their horrible living conditions, 16-hour workdays, and their wages that could not support their families, but he refused and fired them. Many of the workers also sent Pullman telegraphs addressing their dire situation. One of the telegraphs sent said, "We, the people of Pullman, who by the greed and oppression of George M. Pullman have been brought to a condition where starvation stares us in the face, do hereby appeal to you for aid in this hour of need. We have been refused employment and have no means of leaving this vicinity, and our families are starving." As more workers began to speak out and join unions, many of them were fired, which led to the voting of a strike. At the time when the workers decided to go on strike, 35% were represented by the ARU, the American Railway Union, which led a strike the year before against the Great Northern Railway Company. The organizer behind this strike was none other than Eugene V. Debs. He began as a part of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. This was an institution that worked to employ locomotive firemen and afford mutual support to these firemen. Debs was elected city clerk of Terre Haute, Indiana, where he served 2 terms. He later went on to serve 1 term in the Indiana House of Representatives. Already a distinguished political figure, he became involved with labor activism, and he established a labor union called the American Railway Union, of which he was the president of. His goal with this inauguration was to create an industrial union which would unite all railroad workers. Debs' ambition is shown by his famous remark, "The most heroic word in all languages is revolution." On June 22nd, the ARU decided on a boycott unless the company agreed to submit a dispute to arbitration by the 26th. The company refused, so the ARU came up with a plan where workers called the switchmen would refuse to add or remove Pullman cars from trains and would then get fired. Non-union members would be hired, which would lead to other union members to walk out, bringing more trains to a halt. This worked, and on June 27th, over 5,000 workers left their jobs and 15 railroads were tied up. The influence of the ARU was so dominant that railroad workers in 27 different U.S. states and territories joined the strike. The union specifically requested that trainmen not operate any Pullman-owned cars. Railroad owners responded to this, saying that they had a contract with the company and the workers were legally required to operate the Pullman cars. The workers were not submissive to these orders, which resulted in large obstruction of America's railroads. The expansion of the strike was so vast that the Pullman Company was forced to shut down on May 11th. By June 26th, many small unions had joined the ARU. The ARU became a corporation made up of 465 unions and claimed ownership of 15,000 unions nationally. By the next day, over 40,000 workers walked off, and by the third day there were over 100,000 strikers, and over 20 railroads were tied up or completely stopped. On June 29th, Debs spoke out on Blue Island, Illinois, to gather support from the railway workers. After he left, people broke out in violence and set fire to buildings and deactivated a locomotive from the U.S. mail train. By June 30th, 125,000 workers had walked off from 29 different railroads who did not want to handle Pullman cars.
This greatly upset President Grover Cleveland, and on July 2nd, the railroad company lawyers and the Attorney General Richard Olney took the case to a federal court and filed injunction against the strikers using two arguments. The first point was that the strike was in restraint of trade, which violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed by Congress in 1890. It outlawed monopolistic business practices like trusts. They also argued that the strike impeded federal mail deliveries, which was said to be a federal offense. This injunction prohibited ARU leaders from compelling or inducing railroad workers to refuse or fail to perform any of their duties. The injunction, which supported the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act, also prevented the ARU leaders from communication with their subsidiaries or fellow workers. The president of the ARU was pleased with the success of the boycott, but many workers were becoming angry and violent. On July 3rd, in an effort to contain and terminate the violence, state governments across the nation deployed military troops. Debs thought that the troops would allow their boycott to proceed peacefully, but it became rather clear that they were only there to keep the trains moving. The strikers became furious when the troops intervened, and on July 6th, over 6,000 rioters destroyed hundreds of rail cars in the South Chicago Panhandle yards. This strike affected everyone. Farmers worried about getting their crops to the market. Many others were worried about their mail and what the strike would do to the availability and price of goods. With the federal injunction being put in place, President Grover Cleveland could not treat the strike as a federal issue, so he ordered troops to be sent to Chicago on July 3rd. Governor Altgeld was outraged by this and said that the president must not have known all of the facts and that it was unjustified. John Altgeld, the governor of Illinois at the time, sent a telegram to George Pullman which read, "I have received numerous reports to the effect that there is great distress at Pullman. Today I received a formal appeal as governor from a committee of the Pullman people for aid. They state that 1,600 families, including women and children, are starving, that they cannot get work and have not the means to go elsewhere, that your company has brought men from all over the United States to fill their places. Now, these people live in your town and were your employees. Some of them worked for your company for many years. They must be people of industry and character, or you would not have kept them. Many of them have practically given their lives to you." The ARU leaders could not even do anything to stop the violence because the injunction disabled any communication with the strikers. Even with 6,000 state and federal troops, 3,100 state police, and 5,000 deputy marshals, they could not contain the violence. On July 7th, after some of the National Guardsmen were assaulted, they fired into the crowd and killed between 4 and 30 people and wounded many others. Debs urged to call off the strike and that the Pullman Company rehire all workers except those convicted of a crime without prejudice. The General Managers Association, which was the federation of the railroads that had overseen the response to the strike, refused and instead hired all non-union workers. Over time, the strike slowed and the trains began to run back on schedule. On August 2nd, the Pullman Car Company reopened and agreed to hire the strikers on the condition that they signed a pledge to never join a union again. After the whole ordeal, the company lost millions of dollars and the strikers lost over $1 million in wages. As many as 250,000 workers went on strike in over 27 states. After the boycott was over, the strikers lost the sympathy of the public, and Harper's Magazine said, "The nation was fighting for its own existence, just as truly as in suppressing the Great Rebellion." On July 7th, Debs and 4 other ARU leaders were arrested for contempt of court or for violating the injunction and for criminal conspiracy to interfere with the U.S. mail. All 5 were later released with a $10,000 bond. In December, Debs and his Confederates tried in front of Judge Woods, who ruled in favor of both charges and sentenced them to 6 months in prison. This court ruling discontinued the strike. During Debs's time served in prison, he read publishings by Karl Marx and other renowned socialists. Once Debs was released in 1895 with the socialism influence, he discerned the flaws in America economically and politically. Additionally, he recognized the struggling of the labor movement. He decided to take initiative and create the Socialist Party of America and was one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World. Even though the outcome of the strike was unsuccessful and failed to settle disputes between workers and the capital, the occurrences of the Pullman strike led to greater attention being brought to America's corrupt labor system. It caused people to see the underlying problems and question the government's lack of active resolution to these problems. With the people and the capital pitted against each other, labor legislation reformers raced to find a way to protect the interests of both sides. Through Debs and the ARU's persistence, the Pullman strike is seen as a paramount defining moment in America's democracy. America remains a changed country because of the legislative action that was taken after the affairs of the Pullman strike.